1932, Ukraine. No one understood why the children smiled as they starved. The Poltava Diary. The year was 1932. Ukraine's golden fields swayed in the wind, but they held a silence darker than death. From a distance, the land looked rich, alive, abundant. But those who walked between the rows of wheat knew the truth. The grain was not theirs. It was taken. The Soviet authorities demanded quotas no village could meet. Trucks rolled in, soldiers marched behind them, and the harvest vanished under guarded hands. The fields whispered of betrayal. Families stared at stalks of wheat they were forbidden to touch, while their children's stomachs caved inward. The irony was unbearable. Starvation in a sea of food. The whispers grew at night. In hushed voices, mothers spoke of hidden caches, of seeds buried beneath floorboards, of bread crusts hidden in sleeves. Children were taught silence. They were told that even a careless laugh, even a word spoken too loudly, could bring soldiers crashing through the door. Fear became the language of survival. Yet the grain fields, endless and bright under the summer sun, seemed to mock the villagers. How could so much abundance belong to no one? The children looked out across the horizon, eyes wide, lips dry. Some smiled, not from joy, but because hunger warped their faces into strange masks. It was the kind of smile that unsettled anyone who saw it. The earth itself seemed to remember their suffering. Dry winds carried dust across roads lined with footprints of families walking toward nowhere. Every path led away from food. Every rumor of bread drew crowds like moths to a flame, and every time they arrived too late. Whispers became prayers, but prayers turned bitter. At night, old men swore they heard the fields talking back, rustling with voices of the dead. A father, digging furrows with blistered hands, claimed he heard his daughter's laughter in the wheat. She had died 2 weeks earlier, yet her voice floated through the grain like wind chimes in a storm. He stopped digging and wept into the soil, his tears darkening the earth he could not eat. The whispers also came from Moscow. Orders, quotas, threats. Every telegram was another nail in the villager's coffin. Yet no one dared to rebel. Rebellion meant death. Silence meant slow death. Families chose the silence. The children watched their parents fade. Some tried to help. They pulled roots from the ground, chewed bark from trees, sucked stones to trick their bodies into thinking food was near. And still, their eyes carried a strange brightness. A smile would twitch on their lips, a defiance born not from hope but from delirium. It haunted those who saw it. How could a starving child still smile? By autumn, the whispers in the fields had turned into cries in the night. Wolves prowled the edges of villages, their howls mixing with the wails of mothers rocking children who would not wake again. The grain still swayed in the distance, untouched, guarded, shipped away to cities that never starved. In Poltava, one diary recorded it all. Its first pages spoke of the whispers, the fields, and the children's strange smiles. The writer could not understand them. Perhaps no one ever would. The village of Poltava had once been filled with laughter. Children chasing chickens through dusty lanes. Women gossiping by wells. Men returning from the fields with sweat on their brows and songs on their lips. But by the winter of 1932, silence ruled the streets. Every step felt heavy. Every eye looked hollow. Hunger was no longer a visitor. It had become the master. The people of Poltava learned to hide it. Hunger was dangerous when shown. Soldiers searched for weakness. Neighbors betrayed one another for crumbs. To admit you were starving was to risk everything. Mothers rubbed ash on their faces to look stronger. Fathers straightened their backs though their ribs pressed against their skin like knives. Children learned the art of stillness, sitting quietly, pretending to nap so no one would notice their trembling. Hunger was hidden behind locked doors, but it leaked out, in the way a girl fainted while carrying water, in a way a boy's legs wobbled as though made of straw, in a way families lingered near the smell of baked bread, even when the bakery was empty. And yet, there were secrets. In barns, holes were dug into the ground, lined with sacks of grain that had somehow escaped confiscation. In attics, Families hid jars of beans, strips of dried fruit, even a single loaf of bread. Children were told never to speak of it. If a soldier asked, they were to smile, to say they were full, to say their mother had fed them well. The lie became survival. But lies had cracks. One night, a family was dragged from their home after a neighbor whispered they were hiding food. The father swore he had nothing. Soldiers tore apart the house, split open the walls, ripped up the floorboards. They found nothing. Still, the family was gone by morning. The village began to fear its own eyes. A hungry glance at a neighbor's pot could be seen as envy, as accusation. A whispered word could be twisted into betrayal. Trust died as quickly as the cattle, their bones left in the snow. But in the diary of Poltava, the writer noticed something strange. Despite the fear, despite the betrayal, the children still smiled. Their eyes, wide and unblinking, carried a brightness no adult could fake. They smiled as though mocking death itself. The villagers could not understand it. Some thought it was courage. Others said madness. One mother whispered that the smiles were a gift from God, given to children so they would not know despair. Whatever the reason, it unsettled everyone. Winter deepened. Snow blanketed the fields that once shimmered gold. The village held its breath. Nights grew longer, colder, quieter. Behind every window, hunger waited. It pressed its hand against every chest, hollowed every cheek, darkened every dream. And yet, in that darkness, the children's smiles glowed like faint candles, a cruel reminder of innocence untouched, or innocence already slipping into another world. The village hid its hunger, but could not hide those smiles. The children of Poltava carried bowls that never filled. They sat at wooden tables, waiting for meals that would never come. A spoon scraped against the bottom of an empty pot, echoing like a funeral bell through the house. But the children did not cry. They smiled. The smiles were not of joy. They were strange, haunting, stretched too wide across pale faces. Their lips cracked, their teeth small and uneven, yet the expression lingered as if carved into them by hunger itself. Parents feared those smiles more than the silence. A mother once wrote in her diary that her son laughed while holding an empty cup. He turned it upside down, shaking it as if drops of soup might fall out. When nothing came, he smiled at her, his eyes too bright, too knowing. She broke down in tears, begging him to stop. He only smiled harder, as if trying to comfort her. It was not comfort. It was delirium. Starvation twisted the mind. At first, children dreamed of food, spoke of it endlessly. They played games where they pretended to cook, stirring air with twigs, serving invisible feasts on dirty plates. But as days passed, something shifted. They grew quiet. Their games faded. And then came the smiles. Doctors, years later, would call it a symptom of the body shutting down. The brain, deprived of nourishment, turned suffering into strange illusions. But in 1932, the villagers had no such words. They only saw their children staring back at them with those unsettling grins, as if they were already halfway gone. Some believed the smiles were defiance, that the children, too weak to fight, mocked hunger with the only weapon left to them. Others whispered the smiles were a sign that the children saw something the living could not. Angels, perhaps, or shadows. One girl, no older than 7, collapsed in the snow outside her home. When her mother lifted her, the child's lips curved into that familiar smile. She died in her arms, smiling still. The mother screamed into the night, her wails carrying across the village. But the child's face never changed, frozen in eerie peace. The diary from Poltava described it again and again. The children smile as they starve. The writer penned, her hands trembling. It is the most terrible thing I have ever seen. Their laughter does not belong to this earth. It belongs to something else, something waiting. Adults began to avoid looking directly at their children. Fathers turned away from the dinner table. Mothers blew out candles quickly at night, unwilling to see those smiles flicker in the shadows. It was unbearable to watch innocence bend into horror. Still, the children endured longer than anyone expected. Their bodies, fragile as reeds, seemed to cling to life even as the adults grew weaker. Perhaps it was the resilience of youth. Perhaps it was cruelty. But those bright eyes lingered, shining in the dark, reminding everyone that hunger had not yet claimed its last victim. And always the smiles remained. On Sundays, the bells no longer rang. Once their sound had rolled across the fields of Poltava, calling families to gather in the white-walled church that stood proudly in the village square. Children had once tugged at their mother's skirts, running up the stone steps with eager laughter. But by 1932, the churchyard had grown silent. The bells had been taken down, the icons stripped away. Even faith, it seemed, had been confiscated. Yet the people still came. Not with hymns, not with candles, but with silence. Mothers wrapped in wool shawls walked slowly across the snow, carrying bundles not of bread but of grief. Fathers followed, their boots heavy, their eyes blank. The children were too weak to run. They shuffled beside them, their smiles faint in the cold air. The churchyard became a place of mourning, not worship. Graves appeared one after another, mounds of earth rising like broken ribs beneath the snow. There were no priests left to bless the dead, only whispers and hurried prayers. Still, the villagers buried their loved ones together, as if unity in death could ease the loneliness of starvation. One Sunday, the diary's author wrote of a gathering in the yard. Families huddled close, their breath rising in pale clouds. A child had died the night before, and though no priest remained, the villagers could not bear to let her pass in silence. They stood around the small coffin, listening to the mother hum an old hymn she could barely finish. Her voice cracked. The snowflakes fell gently onto the wooden lid, melting into dark stains. The children watched, their empty stomachs growling, yet their lips curled upward. They smiled as though they understood something their parents did not. It unsettled everyone. One father muttered that the smiles were curses, signs that the famine had twisted their souls. Another whispered that the children saw heaven before them, and that was why they grinned. No one knew. The church itself grew colder, emptier. Doors creaked in the wind, windows rattled, dust gathered on the pews. Some villagers claimed they heard footsteps inside when no one was there. Others swore that the faint sound of bells returned on certain nights, though no bells remained. The churchyard filled faster than anyone imagined. Whole families vanished. Graves blurred together beneath the snow. Children were buried, still smiling, their faces peaceful, almost mocking the hunger that had stolen them. The silence of Sundays became unbearable. Yet the people came still, gathering not out of faith but out of fear of being forgotten. They whispered names, carved initials into wooden crosses, left scraps of cloth tied to branches above the graves. The diary's author confessed she no longer prayed. Her words were simple. If God is here, he hides. If God listens, he does not answer. Only the children smile. It was a confession soaked in despair. And yet, she too returned every Sunday. She stood in the churchyard among the graves, listening to the snow crunch under her boots, watching the children sway weakly at their mother's sides. She wrote that she could not decide which was more haunting, the graves of those who had gone, or the grins of those who remained. The silence of a churchyard was heavier than any sermon. It was a silence filled with hunger, with doubt, with the unspoken terror that soon there would be no one left to gather. Bread was once the heartbeat of Poltava. Warm loaves lined kitchen tables, their crusts split open, steam rising into the air. Children tore pieces with eager hands, dipping them in milk or honey, their laughter filling the room. Bread was more than food. It was life itself. By 1932, bread had become a ghost. The rations disappeared first. Villagers lined up outside storehouses with bowls and sacks, waiting in the cold. Hours passed. Soldiers handed out scraps, sometimes nothing at all. Mothers begged for just a crust, just something for the children. The guards looked past them, their rifles resting against their shoulders. Then came the raids. Homes were stripped of flour, grain, even crumbs swept from the floor. Women clutched their breadboards to their chests, weeping as soldiers smashed them to pieces. Families searched their barns, their fields, their cellars, but the bread was gone. It vanished like smoke. And with the bread, the fathers began to vanish too. Some left at night, walking toward distant towns rumored to have food. They promised to return with sacks of flour, with potatoes, with anything. They never returned. Some are caught by soldiers, accused of hoarding, and dragged away to prisons from which no letters came. Others collapsed on the roads, their bodies left for the crows. The diary spoke of one father in particular. He kissed his children goodbye, his beard rough against their hollow cheeks. He carried nothing but a burlap sack and his wife's blessing. The children smiled at him as he walked away. Days passed, then weeks. His wife waited at the window until her own strength failed. His shadow never crossed the threshold again. The absence of men grew louder than their presence. Fields lay empty, plows rusting in the soil. At night, the homes echoed with silence. Mothers tried to fill the void, their voices trembling as they sang lullabies they could not finish. Children asked where their fathers had gone, and the answers were whispers, never truths. The bread was gone. The fathers were gone. The two losses became one. In Poltava, hunger hollowed everything. Families broke apart under its weight. Fathers who remained grew gaunt, their shoulders bent, their hands trembling. They could no longer protect, no longer provide. Some slipped into despair, avoiding the eyes of their children. The diary captured the moment one such father sat at the table, his hands folded, staring at nothing. His daughter placed her empty bowl before him, smiling with the strange brightness only starving children carried. He looked at her, then lowered his head into his hands. She kept smiling until the candlelight flickered out. The vanishing of bread was expected. The vanishing of fathers was not. It was not just death, but erasure. Fathers disappeared without graves, without goodbyes. They became rumors, stories told in low voices, shadows flickering at the edge of memory. And as winter deepened, the children's smiles grew sharper, as though they understood that the men who had once been pillars of the home had been broken by hunger too. Poltava was left with empty tables, empty bowls, empty doorways where fathers once stood, and the children smiled still. When the fathers vanished, the mothers remained. Bent, frail, hollow-eyed, they carried the unbearable weight of survival. They had no bread to give, no milk to pour, no harvest to cook. All they had left were memories, and they fed their children with those. At night, when hunger clawed too sharply, the mothers told stories. They spoke of summers before the famine, when orchards bloomed and rivers shimmered with fish. They described tables heavy with dumplings, stews rich with meat, bread so warm it burned the fingers. Their children listened, wide-eyed, their smiles brightening at the thought of a feast that would never come. The mothers' voices trembled. Sometimes they closed their eyes, tasting the past on their tongues as if it might nourish them. They chewed the memory of bread. They swallowed the ghost of milk. They fed themselves with recollections, and for a moment, they believed it was enough. But memory does not fill the stomach. The diary told of one mother who carried a single crust of bread in her pocket. It was old, hard as stone, nearly crumbling. She never ate it. She only held it, feeling its weight. At night, she pressed it into her palm and pretended to chew, pretending it kept her alive. When her youngest son asked why she never ate, she smiled and told him she was already full. She fed him her lie. He smiled back, his lips cracked and dry. Mothers sacrificed silently. They cut their portions smaller. They gave away the last drop of broth. They pressed their lips to their babies' foreheads and prayed their own weakness would not betray them. Some collapsed quietly in corners, too weak to rise again. Their children, confused, tried to wake them, shaking their shoulders, still smiling through the horror of not understanding. The diary described one chilling scene. A mother sat in a rocking chair, her body frail as twigs. She sang an old lullaby in a hoarse whisper, rocking an infant who had already grown still. The neighbors found her hours later, still singing, her eyes glassy, her lips curved in a faint, peaceful smile. The child's smile mirrored hers. The power of mothers was not in bread or milk. It was in memory, in the ability to create hope from ashes, in the strength to tell children stories of abundance while their own bones ached from emptiness. But memories can only carry a soul so far. As the famine deepened, even memories began to rot. Stories grew shorter. Voices cracked. Lullabies fell silent. The children smiled anyway, as though carrying the mother's burden for them. Their smiles, eerie and luminous, seemed to say, "We will not cry. We will not make this harder for you." The diary's author wrote with despair. The mothers feed us with their love, with their past, with their sorrow. But love is not bread, and sorrow does not keep us alive. Still, she admitted, there was something sacred in the way the mothers endured. They starved quietly, bravely, hiding their pain so their children could smile one more time. And so, in the village of Poltava, the mothers fed on memories, while the children fed on their mothers' lies, smiling through the hunger that grew sharper each day. When Poltava's hunger deepened, the villagers turned to paper. They wrote letters, desperate words scrawled in ink and pencil, sometimes even charcoal when supplies ran out. They wrote to Moscow. They begged. The letters spoke of empty barns, of children who smiled with hollow cheeks, of mothers who fed on memories, of fathers who vanished on the roads. "Help us," they wrote. "We are loyal. We are obedient. But we are dying." The diary described these letters in heartbreaking detail. Families gathered scraps of paper, smoothing them out on rough tables. They dipped pens into ink that had already dried, watering it down to stretch a few more words. Every stroke was shaky, as though the hunger itself weakened their hands. When the letters were finished, they sealed them with trembling fingers and sent them on their way. To Moscow, to the men who held power over life and death. But the letters never came back. Weeks passed, months, no reply. The villagers began to wonder if the letters had even left Poltava. Perhaps they were intercepted. Perhaps the soldiers burned them. Or worse, perhaps Moscow had read them and simply did not care. Hope rotted faster than bread. One woman, whose son had starved in her arms, received a telegram. She opened it with shaking hands, thinking it might be salvation. Instead, it was an order. More grain must be delivered. She fell to her knees, clutching the paper, weeping. The boy's body lay on the bed behind her, his face still curled in that haunting smile. Some villagers tried again. They wrote not to Moscow, but to distant relatives, to cousins in other towns, to brothers who had moved away. But the letters never reached them. Some were stolen, others confiscated. The mail carts, too, were watched. The diary described the moment a group of children found torn letters scattered in a ditch. They picked them up, smiling, pretending to read them aloud as though they contained good news. In truth, the pages were blank, the words washed away by rain. Still, the children laughed, their strange joy echoing against the silence of the fields. By spring of 1933, no one trusted the letters anymore. They became confessions whispered on a paper that no one would hear. A man wrote of his wife's death, his ink blotting the page with tears. A mother wrote of her daughter's strange smile, how she feared it meant the girl was already halfway gone. The letters stacked in drawers, in boxes. Some were buried beneath floorboards, hidden like grain. They became testimonies to suffering that no one in Moscow would ever acknowledge. The diary itself was a letter. The writer admitted she never expected it to be read. She wrote because she had to, because silence felt like a greater death than starvation. Her words bled with grief. We write into the void. Our cries vanish like smoke. The children smile, but Moscow does not. The letters never reached Moscow, but they remained, fragile pieces of paper, carrying the voices of a village that refused to disappear in silence, even as hunger devoured them one by one. It was in the spring thaw of 1933 that the diary spoke of hiding itself. The writer, her hands trembling with weakness, confessed she no longer trusted anyone, not neighbors, not the postman, not even the silence of her own home. Paper had become dangerous. Words could betray. A single line against Moscow meant exile, prison, or worse. So she buried them. The orchard behind her house was once filled with apples. Red, round, sweet. Children had climbed its branches, their laughter ringing as they dropped fruit into baskets. But by the famine years, the orchard was a graveyard of bare trees. Branches snapped in the cold. Bark was stripped away for soup. Roots were dug up and boiled, leaving only twisted scars in the soil. In that broken orchard the woman dug. She placed her diary in a tin box, wrapping it with a scarf that had once belonged to her daughter. The pages were already stained with tears, with candle smoke, with the faint marks of trembling hands. She lowered it into the earth as though burying a child, pressing the soil back with careful fingers. Her words in the diary that survived read like a confession. If no one reads this, at least the earth will know. At least the trees will remember. The orchard became her witness. Every night she returned, pressing her palms into the dirt, whispering to the box hidden beneath. She prayed it would outlive her, that one day someone would dig it up and know the truth. But as she wrote those words, she admitted her fear. What if no one ever did? What if the diary rotted in silence, like the families buried in unmarked graves across Poltava? The orchard carried its own ghosts. Children still wandered there, smiling their strange smiles, too weak to climb the branches. They sat in the grass, chewing bark, pretending it was fruit. Some collapsed in the shade, their lips curled upward as though mocking the famine itself. Mothers dragged them back home, their arms thin as twigs. The writer saw them from her window. She saw their smiles. She heard their laughter drift across the night, eerie, hollow, echoing between the trees. It haunted her. She wrote that the orchard seemed alive with voices of both the living and the dead. One evening, soldiers came. They searched homes, barns, fields. They even walked through the orchard, their boots crunching on frost. The woman's heart froze. She imagined them finding the tin box, opening it, reading her words aloud before dragging her away. But they found nothing. They left. The orchard kept her secret. Still, she knew she was not safe. Hunger had thinned her body to bone. Her children were gone. Her husband had not returned. She was alone with her words and her fear. Her final lines in that section trembled with resignation. If I am gone, the orchard will speak for me. If I am forgotten, the diary will not. And so, in Poltava, beneath the twisted roots of starving trees, a voice was buried. A fragile voice, pressed into the earth with the hope that one day someone would listen. The orchard stood silent, leafless, broken, but beneath its soil, the truth waited. By the summer of 1933, Poltava's homes had become hollow shells. Doors creaked open with the wind. Windows stood broken, curtains swaying like ghosts.